Well, hello, and welcome to Beyond the Binary. I'm wondering if we can start with maybe just you providing an introduction about who you are, what it is that you do, and then maybe connect that to how you're connected to TSQ as well.
My name is Julian Carter. I'm always called Ian, but I publish under Julian. I have a degree in U.S. history, but because the work I do is, and always has been, interdisciplinary to the point of being just weird by most historian standards, I've never had a job in an academic history department. And over the years, as I've moved from school to school as a junior faculty member, I began to realize that I really just tremendously enjoyed working with student populations that were interested in using their minds for creative purposes, not only as a stepping stone toward a requirement of some kind or a hoop that they were jumping through. So over the course of a number of years, I found myself teaching at an arts and design institution. I teach at California College for the Arts in San Francisco and Oakland. And in that capacity, I was teaching in that capacity when TSQ was first proposed, and after many years working in historically inflected LGBT studies, I had just begun in my own research pursuing more arts-related questions for myself and in relation to my teaching. So the timing was really right for me when TSQ wanted to do a issue on cultural production, broadly defined, as part of its first volume. And that is how I got involved with the editorial board. The intersection with my own research and teaching is pretty tight.
Well, I'm wondering, the actual wording is culture production. Is that right?
Transcultural production.
Transcultural production. Is it possible to try to break that down a little bit about what that means in terms of how do you understand cultural production, or what does that mean to you, in what capacities and what ways, or better yet, what has been the response from interested writers, for instance, how that's been defined?
It's been very interesting, actually. Our call for papers focused on the arts. Okay. My own understanding of transcultural production is broader than only the arts. To write that into the call for papers in an accessible way. But that is the thing that's interesting about cultural production, is that on the one hand, things that trans people do create trans culture. Yeah. So there is a way in which simply living in the world as a trans person, however you understand what that means, is taking part in transcultural production. You are making trans culture by moving through the world as a trans person. But there's a narrower meaning as well, which focuses on the production aspect, that says that cultural producers are people who make things, people who participate actively and creatively in shaping the culture in which they and the rest of us live. So these may be musicians, they may be videographers, they may be novelists or poets, they might be sculptors, but they may also be people who work in fields that are allied, like architectural critics or lighting designers, or arguably members of the foundations that fund arts production, or members of public groups that gather to do things like raise money to make a memorial for someone that is important to their group. Those are all different ways that people are involved in cultural production in this more concrete material sense. Transcultural production was our title for this issue for a couple of reasons. One is obviously the journal seeks to be the journal of record for transgender studies. So the trans in the title does refer most obviously to transgender and transsexual people and culture that they make and cultural productions that seek to represent them. But it also means transcultural, cultural production that takes place across cultural borders. And we were interested in writing a call for papers that stimulated artists and critics and people who are interested in these issues to think about trans as a heuristic lens, as a way of understanding the creative work of making culture, especially across boundaries that are conventionally maintained, but not always in artistic practice or in creative imagination.
This latter part between, I guess, transgender and then also transgender cultural production and then also transcultural production, did you have a lot of response from those, for writers who were writing about that transcultural production, or does that seem to be a difficulty with the journal perhaps?
We are defining trans as looking at movement across categories. And we also wanted to make a really clear and explicit call for people whose category crossing is across lines of gender and sexuality. So we did get submissions that were clearly aimed and targeted at representations of people that most people in the West would understand as trans people. And we also received submissions that aimed to discuss the movement of arts and representations from one continent to another, which is a different way of understanding what transcultural production can be about. We are still debating what we think is a strong and provocative and engaging selection of the submissions. We had a very good response. We had 53 submissions before the deadline, and a handful are still coming in significantly later, because that is the way that these things work, right? If you put out a global call for papers in January, you will find people in Finland who maybe missed it, or somewhere in Thailand, and they will write and say, oh, I know it's past the deadline, but could I submit something? And generally speaking, our answer is yes. We really want to hear from you, and sometimes really seeking a global reach means being flexible about deadlines. But the point for us, and emphasizing the complexity and double meaning of the prefix trans, was to cast a very wide net and invite perspectives on what culture is that we maybe couldn't anticipate in advance. That is what makes an emerging field exciting to participate in, is that you can't know in advance who's doing what fantastic work out there. I was sort of hoping that we might, for instance, get something, an example of transcultural production that we did not in fact get, but I was hoping to solicit from someone, would be someone who's working on interesting design for prosthetic limbs, which is a growing business. Absolutely. And an area of industrial design that involves the capacity to really creatively reimagine what the human body can look like, which to me is an area that that is an area where transcultural critics should be looking. What's happening here? For example, we're also getting some really interesting stuff about objects and structures that are not gendered, much less transgender. And some of them are very interesting indeed. Like there's a piece that has been offered to us that's about the High Line in Manhattan, the public parks that are being made on an old elevated railway, and the impact of that kind of avant-garde design on the trans communities and histories that used to work and live in those areas. And so the design itself is in a very interesting tension with the city and the gendered and sexual history of the neighborhoods through which it moves. And that is another example of transcultural production that's using a trans historical and political lens to look at urban architecture.
Is there pressure involved in terms of the articles that you do decide or land on publishing, that in some way that becomes a way of defining what transcultural production is, and then as a result, other articles? I mean, what's that pressure? Yes. There's got to be pressure involved in what this means.
It's something that we're talking a lot about as we engage with potential authors for this issue, is that we are really concerned that there may be an inadvertent canon formation function. And there's a couple of things that we're doing to try to counter that. One is to include a really wide range of types of approaches. It's difficult to make a canon by accident. If we are trying to avoid featuring work on kind of the obvious subject, like, I don't know, RuPaul's Drag Race, for instance, partly because there are other venues where I think such work could find publication. Although I can imagine that if somebody did something really interesting and provocative with RuPaul, would be happy to do it. We have nothing against TV or with RuPaul or with drag. But I do have some concern about seeming to define what an appropriate object of study is too narrowly. I do think that if we include the parks built on abandoned railroad track, modernist painting, questions about how you define the gender of a literary text, that kind of range, I hope will make it very difficult for this particular volume to serve as some kind of cannon in the egg. The other strategy that TSQ is pursuing to avoid that canonization problem is a longer range one, and that is that each issue of the journal will have an arts and culture section where there will be some commentary or possibly an image printed or a poem printed. It depends on the editors of that particular issue what the most appropriate strategy is. But there will be something in each issue. And because each issue is edited by different people, that ought to have it ought to help make the boundaries a little more porous.
I'm wondering if you can speak on what you personally believe the importance of TSQ is, or why we need TSQ. If you have a couple words on that.
Okay, yeah, the big picture. Well, the goal, it is not a modest goal. TSQ is part of the project of changing the way the world thinks about transgender. And in order to do that, it is trying to situate itself as the journal of record for a newly interdisciplinary trans studies. What that means is that, in practice, this is the first non-medical journal dedicated to trans subjects.
Right.
And as such, simply by existing, it will necessarily change the conditions for transgender knowledge production worldwide.
Absolutely.
Because when there is an organ devoted to the subject of trans culture, trans being, trans politics, trans theory that is not originating in or necessarily in conversation with psychopathological perspectives, and rather is promoting the widest possible range of scholarship on trans phenomena, that right there will make a real difference in the way that trans can be thought. It's not that I think that some of the psychiatric literature is very pro-trans. Much of the medical literature is increasingly being written by people who are trans themselves or are really committed and effective trans allies. I have no intention of denigrating the important and sometimes very progressive work that takes place in medical and psychiatric journals where most work on transgender has been published. But it's a very, very small part of the universe of trans being.
Yeah.
And it has the unfortunate tendency to define what trans is in relation to a medical model that is applicable to a comparatively small number of people, mostly in the developed West. Whereas phenomena that you might understand as trans in one way or another are much bigger and can be approached fruitfully from a great many perspectives that aren't about seeking surgically or hormonally assisted sex change in that very narrow definition that has dominated much of the medical and psychiatric literature. So that's the big picture, simply by allowing for the world to be a bigger and more complex place with far more complex understandings of gender and an understanding of trans that exceeds gender. This journal will change the way that people think about trans.
For me, I mean, the field, the discipline that even though I'm studying performance studies, it's housed in communication studies. And as a communication scholar, I do hold true, or rather, I hold true the idea that reality, everything is constituted through communication. And for me, this is why the importance of something like TSQ means so much, because it's the actual way that this journal, the very existence of this journal is creating the possibilities, the material possibilities of being different in the world and allowing for, I think, a variety of ways of thinking about our own genders and other people's genders, of ways that we can be in the world that cannot be accounted for in, I think, much of the current literature, if you will. Yeah, and I find that to be such a special thing.
I do think that especially no, it's fine. I think especially in performance studies that I'm very excited about the way that trans can intersect with performance studies, because I do see performance as one of the most dynamic fields of interdisciplinary theoretical and practical discussion happening. I really like the way that performance studies combine practitioner with academic perspectives so that the two sets of credentials are really not clear. And that is part of my hope for what we're doing with trans as well, that the distinction between us and them that was such a problem in a more medically dominated version of this discussion, I think can be broken down. But I think that one way of doing that is by shifting the focus away, sometimes, not always, but sometimes away from gender long enough to look at the parts of trans that are about movement. So, for instance, because trans means to cross, it has the linguistic capacity to add motion to any word that it modifies. Yeah. And one consequence is that it is an extraordinarily fruitful word prefix for thinking about the movement art. My own work at the moment is focused on dance performance and on the ways that people who are embedded practitioners and scholars of dance have to learn to see movement and feel movement differently than people who are not. embedded in worlds that base an art on the body in motion. That seems to me to be exactly the kind of place that trans studies can go for a sophisticated movement analysis vocabulary, right? There's no reason you can't take from one field and say, wow, look at this incredible precision of perception and articulation that's been developed over here in this area that isn't aware of itself as having anything to say to trans studies. Let me show you how that works. In terms of performance studies, I'm especially interested in the way that because of the association of transsexual identification with transition, there is a moment in time where specific kinds of embodied actions take place that help to qualify one as transsexual in the older medical model. Well, moments where specific forms of eventful embodied action take place, that's where performance studies began, thinking about exactly such moments. So what can performance studies tell trans about how time and presence work, and what can trans offer back that maybe performance studies didn't know? Those are the questions that I'm working on now.
Are you planning on extending some of this discourse in TSQ, or is this a book you're working on, or ongoing research in general?
It's ongoing research. I have a couple of pieces in progress. At the moment, I'm on a panel at PSI. We're doing a praxis session that's mixing practitioners and academics it's a session called The Transtemporality of Fluidase in Blood, that's about questions of endurance and virtuosity and self-care and labor and standards for evaluating success or failure. And all these things that come together in virtuosic physical performance that's based on repetition art and causes damage. And it should be really fun. There were a couple of questions that you had originally sent me about TSQ and how it works. And I can talk about its structure and how we imagine what we think we're trying to do.
Perfect. That would be great.
And you would also ask some things about the Kickstarter campaign, so I can talk about money too, if that's of interest.
Okay. Yeah, that sounds great.
Does that work? Okay. So the two general editors, as I'm sure you know, are Susan Stryker, who's currently at Arizona as director of their LGBT Institute, and Paisley Kra, who is a political scientist in New York. There are 24 or 25 people in addition to Susan and Paisley who are sitting on the editorial board. They are in fields, there are 8 of them in gender or women's studies or some version of that. Yeah. And the rest are quite broadly distributed across academic fields that include history, philosophy, law, English, African diaspora studies, communications, cultural studies, sociology, ethnic studies, and psychology. There's also a museum employee and 2 full-time activists, one centered in Berlin and one centered in Argentina. The spread of expertise is intentionally extremely broad, but it is actually not broad enough. Oh, did I mention I think that those 25 people are in, I believe, 8 countries. It is not, however, broad enough to guarantee a really global reach for every single issue. So the way this is going to work best, each issue is a themed special issue that has 1 or 2 members of the editorial board as point people who then go out into their larger intellectual communities and find 1 or 2 additional people who don't work at their institutions, who are in allied fields in some other place, who will co-edit each special issue with them. So that in addition to the 27 of us, I think if you include Paisley and Susan, there are also 2 to 3 more additional guest editors per issue, and of course the usual full panel of peer reviewers. The aim is to reach new and different audiences with each issue. This is partly because the field as emergent does still have a lot of work to do to show people that they may actually have something to contribute to trans studies that they didn't know they had to contribute. Yeah. There are many people, I think, still who imagine trans studies as a kind of small subset of queer studies that looks only at gender. And while there certainly are some trans workers, creatives and intellectuals, who would describe themselves that way, there are many, many more who would not. Our hope is that by working with small groups of knowledgeable editors in all of these different areas, we will be able to grow the field by soliciting outside specialists with their own networks and not only writing very broad calls for papers and disseminating them as widely as we can, but also by soliciting essays from people in fields that don't necessarily focus directly on trans. For example, the first issue, as I think you probably know, is slated to come out in spring of 2014, and it is a double issue because we had such fantastic response to the call for papers. It's on keywords. It's going to be essentially a reference book of a variety, a very wide variety of responses to specific terms that people out in the world suggested to TSQ ought to be considered as keywords for transgender studies in the 21st century. They range from things that are totally obvious, like transition or surgery, to things that might not be so obvious, like music or voice or, let's see, some of the ones that I have read already. There's one on trans poetics. There's one on whiteness. There's one on colonialism. There's a lot. That's the first issue, and that should be very exciting. Other upcoming issues include one that focuses on transnational and cross-cultural understandings of gender specifically. That one is called Decolonizing the Trans Imaginary, and it is designed to provide a venue for specifically anthropological and ethnographic perspectives. There's the transcultural production arts and culture issue that we've already talked about. And then there will be one on demography, epidemiology, and population studies called Making Transgender Count that will be a place for people who work with quantifiable material to come together to see what they share. In addition to these kinds of themed issues, there are also subsections to each issue, like book and film reviews, sections on new media, because so much happens in the blogosphere that's really crucial to trans lives. There will be at least occasional subsections on archives and artifacts, historical documents that we can interpret for our readership or that people send in to us. There can be opinion pieces on controversial or otherwise important current affairs. And there will be a briefly noted section that will simply identify works coming out on trans subjects in the widest possible range of fields, from archaeology and poetics to public policy and law. What do you need to know about the process, like the whole why we're doing an academic journal, how this is getting paid for, why we needed to do Kickstarter? Do you want that kind of stuff?
Yeah, I think the Kickstarter component will be interesting. In general, a lot of my colleagues here, myself included, were a little perplexed as to what that was about. Personally, I was happy to see that there's an affiliation with Duke, and historically I've just loved most of the stuff that Duke tends to at least publish in terms of queer bodies, trans bodies, all kinds of interesting stuff there. So, yeah, maybe just that whole process, what it means to fund this as well, would be really helpful and useful for people maybe who haven't made that choice yet.
Yeah, well, this is the deal. As you may be aware, most academic publishers run at a loss. They very rarely can support themselves, and most of the time, the actual cost of academic publication is borne by a combination of host institutions and, in the case of journals, by fundraising from the journal's editorial board and its prospective readership. This is an increasingly common practice of asking the participants in new journals to cover some of the startup costs. And the reason is that even a very successful new academic journal will not begin to be able to pay for itself for at least the first 5 years, which costs the press that is publishing it about $100,000 before it can begin to see anything, which isn't very much when you think about it in terms of that means you can actually produce an academic journal. All of the costs associated with it are not much more than $20,000 a year. These are not padded budgets. That includes everything from securing permissions to mailing costs to copywriting, to copy editing. That's quite reasonable. But it does add up. And over the course of the 5 years or so that it takes for a new journal to become established so that it can begin to pay the press back, it can cost up to $100,000. No academic press has $100,000 to spare. And so what is increasingly being done is that in order to be able to support non-commercial contemporary scholarship, the presses are asking the intellectual communities that are asking for this journal to contribute to its startup costs. The Kickstarter campaign raised $20,000 in about 2 weeks, which shows a pretty wonderful level of interest and commitment that I think all of us are finding really reassuring, saying, yeah, there really is a swell of interest in this that promises to go somewhere. I think that a number of people have been curious about if academic publishing costs so much and takes so long to become profitable, to break even. Why do we need an academic press? Why aren't we just doing this electronically? Why aren't we self-publishing? And your enthusiasm about Duke titles is actually part of the answer. The short form is we need Duke University Press or someone similar because we need the prestige and respectability that mode of publication provides. Because our goal is to change the world the way that the world thinks about transgender issues, we really need to marshal all of our resources to create the most credible and persuasive interventions possible. And that means we're determined to produce a journal that demands to be taken seriously. Publication through one of the leading academic presses in the world is one way to do that. And the print aspect, rather than an all electronic one, is really largely about ensuring broad access. Not all readers have academic affiliation, and even all readers who will have academic affiliation may not have electronic subscription access through their school libraries. I don't know if you're aware of this, but it is increasingly common for adjunct and lecturer faculty, for part-time unranked faculty, not to have access to full electronic library privileges. And statistically speaking, the majority of visibly peculiar people, the trans and queer among us, as well as the people of color, are the ones who are least likely to have access to free, regular, online access to academic journals. Having this thing exist in print makes it significantly more available to the less served academic populations, and also makes it available to extra academic populations because we can sell single issues through bookstores, both brick-and-mortar bookstores in local communities, and online. We can sell individual issues through Amazon. We can sell them through Giovanni's Room in Philadelphia. We can go anywhere that there is someone who's prepared to sell a book and ask them to stock, or people can go in there and order issues. And it's our intention to make the journal much higher quality through the peer review process that is facilitated by having a very wide community of readers and much more widely available at the same time.
I actually had never thought about getting hold of hard copies of journals in bookstores. Is that going to be a regular practice for TSQ, do you suppose? I
think that it's probably one of the directions that academic journal publishing is going, that increasingly print on demand. It's just a lot more viable for chronically strapped presses. And yes, I do think that in our case more than in some others, but if you notice that increasingly the award-winning, the most provocative current journals in interdisciplinary scholarship are moving towards doing themed special issues. One of the reasons for that is that individual issues then become sort of mini books that are usually more diverse in content and a little bit faster to produce than most academic anthologies or monographs. And so they really provide a comparatively inexpensive and timely state of the field. Sure. That's what's going on at Women's Studies Quarterly, and I know they sell individual issues. Yeah, I think it's becoming more common.
By the time that this show airs, there'll still be a few days left on the Kickstarter campaign, and I'm hoping to at least push a few more people or to convince a few more colleagues, friends, what have you, to take in a few dollars to continue to support the journal now that it's over the $20,000 mark, which is beautiful.
Yes, it is. That's really meaningful, and it has been just so gratifying to see the level of support. Many of these contributions are quite small. $10 is meaningful. And if you happen to have 10,000, would take that too. But not many people do.
Right.
And that's just fine. Fine. We're pretty excited about one of the reasons that I like Kickstarter and that I think is important about having it be part of TSQ's launching is that it does create an initial and fairly tight relationship between a community of concerned people and this intellectual product, so that there's a sense of involvement and accountability on both sides right from the beginning. I really like that a lot.
I was wondering if you had anything that you wanted to place out there, any last words that you may want to close out with.
Is there anything I'm dying to say that we haven't talked about? Is that what you're asking?
There you go. That's great. Look at you.
Well, I guess for my own part, of this project, the part that's focused on arts and culture, I think that I really want to emphasize that there's more than one way for people to be involved in cultural production. I want to make sure that it didn't inadvertently sound as though saying if you're not an artist, you're just living a trans life, that there's that you're not really producing anything. Because actually I think that that's not quite accurate. Here's an example of a kind of transcultural production that I'm actually really excited about right now. Most of us, even if we're not very interested in comic books, have read them at some point in our young personhood. Yeah?
Yeah.
And therefore, it probably won't be a surprise when I point out, you know what? There are a lot of characters in comic books that have either gone through some kind of major bodily transformation or have the capacity to do that as part of the reason that they're in a comic book in the first place, right? There are transformative powers or transformative events are fairly commonplace in that form of literature. And it may therefore seem totally predictable that, in fact, there is a burgeoning movement of trans comic production and trans graphic novels. So there is a definition of transcultural production that would say, oh, those are people who are doing transcultural production, and more power to them, and I love the stuff they're making, and I think it's super interesting. But I would also say that that's only part of it. I'd say that the communities of readers who do things like put together fanzines for older comic book characters that weren't defining themselves as trans, but that are now being read retroactively as having something to say to trans kids and youth. Those fanzines or participation in that fan culture is an active form of transcultural production. When you go to a festival and really don't like the way that the one trans character was represented in that one piece of kind of bad drama, and you write a note to the producer afterwards and say, you know, I really loved the festival, but I really had a problem with this play, and this character was just such a caricature. Yeah. We need to do something about that. I'd really like to get on your volunteer list and help out next year so that I can help make sure that the offerings are of a somewhat different quality. That's participating in transcultural production. Volunteer work, being an educated and informed audience member. I like to think that cultural production does involve more than buying tickets, but I also know that every artist needs an audience. Yeah. Especially because I do work in the performing arts myself, that when I go take ballet class in a trans body, I am not producing trans culture in a very active way. As far as I'm aware, that's not my intention. That's not why I'm going. But I also know that the fact that I am a visibly trans member of a community of performing artists that is in many ways shaped by normative conventions of gender probably does have some impact in some tiny local way on how people understand what counts as a body that can dance. And that's an intervention into the culture that matters too. I think I want to leave with just the observation that just because we have ambitions and lofty ambitions to change the way the world thinks about transgender by marshaling really high-powered thinkers and makers and critics to put together the best of their mind in ways that we really hope can have material effects on how trans people live on the street over time. If you're not one of the highest powered, that doesn't mean that this isn't about you or for you. It just means that you may have a different kind of transcultural production or intellectual production that's more important to you and more appropriate to where you are in the world. If you're sitting in some little town in the South, where I'm from, and you're just dying to be able to go to some trans festival at all so you could complain about how bad the work was, well, maybe you and 10 of your friends need to get together and talk about what you would like to see and then go make it happen. You know, this is very much about that constant feedback loop from small organizations and grassroots efforts and lone individuals trying to follow a voice, and the way that those little efforts begin to add up and accrue momentum and add meaning to the world in ways that are valuable for all of us and that are part of the project of changing the world in ways that make it safer and more hospitable for more different kinds of people to live good lives.
You really articulated that beautifully. I really appreciate that, Ian.
Thank you. It's something I really care about a lot. I really believe in this project.
Yeah, and it certainly shows, and I can't can't underscore how incredibly excited I am. And frankly, I'll be honest, I was giddy this afternoon when I was with my colleagues and friends, letting them know that I get to interview you regarding this project. So I'm really thrilled. I know my partner's thrilled, if not for anything else, at least thrilled for me, the one who reads a lot of academic journals, and I get really excited about them. And I think the prospect of this in terms of, as you're calling them, these lofty goals, I think it's just, it's not only, I don't see it as lofty. I think that this is exactly what activism is in action. And I'm really happy to have some sort of part in it, if not just through readership, then hopefully in the near future when I start submitting stuff to this journal as well, and having a more active, I guess, writing role as well in TSQ. So I'm really looking forward to that myself.
You'd be very welcome to contribute something.
Excellent.
And, we always need peer reviewers, too.
Perfect.
There are many ways to be involved.
How would one go about, volunteering to review articles?
Well, you would do what you just did. You would tell someone who is editing an issue that you could have been involved in but are not, that you're available and knowledgeable.
Oh, perfect.
And
okay.
I have a couple of submissions in performance studies that are going to need peer review shortly.
Perfect.
So you just signed up.
Excellent. I
Volunteering
appreciate
is
that.
dangerous stuff. If you sound available, someone might be listening.
Oh, fair enough. Well, that being said, I am deeply interested, and I would hope that I could lend at least that capacity for now. I would love to review articles for you. That'd be wonderful.
That's great. I will in fact bear you in mind, and we'll be in touch about that.
Perfect.
Okay.
All right, Ian. Well, I thank you very much for your time, this conversation.
Absolutely.
Really appreciate it. Yes.
This has been a total pleasure, Benny.
Excellent.
All right. You have a good evening.
You too. Take care.
Okay,
Bye-bye.
bye.